Today we're going to unpack what trust and safety looks like inside Depop, a community-powered marketplace where culture, creativity and commerce intersect. And rather than focusing solely on enforcement, we are going to explore how Depop builds trust with its community through education, through collaboration, transparency and shared responsibility. And joining me today to dig into all of this is their Global Director of Trust and Safety, Sophie Walsh.
It definitely requires very firm intention to carve out the time to move from reactive to proactive. That culture of urgency can really snowball within the trust and safety function, and it can feel relentless at times. So as much as you can get on the front foot and move into the proactive space, the better for users, the business, and those working in that space.
The internet wasn't built with safety in mind, but today there's a huge community of online trust and safety experts, not just building the rules, but enforcing them too. I'm Ailish Daly, and this is Trust Issues, insights from the people who keep the internet safe. In each edition, we meet the experts shaping how the world experiences the internet, what's allowed online, what's not, and the future of how platforms will protect people. Let's share knowledge and build a safer internet together.
Sophie, welcome to Trust Issues.
Thank you very much.
Just to ease us in, can you tell us about your journey to becoming Director of Trust and Safety at Depop?
Yeah, sure. So my career to date has been alternating between not-for-profit and private sector in roles that have been responsible for overseeing and helping to bring about change in kind of oversight and control functions. So risk, compliance, ethics, safeguarding, investigation, those sorts of things. I spent 7 years at Oxfam leading many of those teams. I was at Groupon when it was at the time the world's fastest growing company. So that was a hoot, leading risk in EMEA, and have done a few kind of project management and consultancy roles also. So generally, my roles have always been about trying to help businesses to do the right thing in the right way.
What an incredible veteran of trust and safety you are. Now, when we think about Depop, of course, people know it as an online marketplace where people buy and sell clothes and fashion accessories. It has over 55 million global users, and it sits at that intersection of commerce, of creativity, of culture in a community-powered marketplace. So from a trust and safety perspective, what does that model mean?
Yeah. So at Depop, we are a peer-to-peer platform. So our community creates the experience that everybody then has. Most of our sellers are also buyers. So understanding them really means understanding both sides of that exchange. And when we think about trust and safety as something built with the community, it's very much about that collaboration rather than moving away from something that we simply apply to it or enforce others to it. And that's why trust and safety decisions are really more nuanced, because listings are often expressions of our community's identity. They can be the output of their personal creativity and even linked to their income if they're relying on Depop as a channel for their business, for example. So that means that our trust and safety actions can sometimes feel a bit more personal to users because our decisions can affect their self-expression and potentially their earnings.
I think that people maybe underestimate just how much judgment then that requires from trust and safety teams when the stakes are, as you've described them.
Yeah, it does. And I think for us, that judgment, the way in which we help our teams to make the right judgment is really to do so as consistently and objectively as possible. So because the content doesn't just exist in isolation on Depop, it's discovered, it's shared, it's interpreted, and it's responded to by others across our platform and beyond. It means that content can travel around, and how people engage with that can be in a more meaningful way. And that's what can change the trust and safety profile that we then have to be very mindful of and manage. And that's a really important consideration for us. So as well as the dynamics of the community itself, we're thinking about how can we influence its impact and how can we be mindful of all of those different things at play.
Because of course it's, Depop is fun to use. It includes all those features that you mentioned, that discovery, the interaction, the visibility around listings. And it also really shows how trust and safety design choices then are inseparable from product design. But also, let me ask you, how do you think about harm differently when content is both a product listing and a form of self-expression?
At Depop, we focus more on prioritizing free expression when it doesn't cause real world harm. So that is really our starting point, and that's one of the guiding principles that we use in designing all of our moderation efforts. So for us, it's really important to protect the self-expression linked to an item or to a listing. So whilst we're not like a social media platform where people can make posts, or sellers might use that content that they make to curate or sell as an expression of their personality and their beliefs. So we think about harm very carefully. It's very important that we ensure that the platform is a safe and trusted place for our buyers and sellers. And at the same time, we really want to enable freedom of expression and free expression as much as possible.
And responding to that, it feels like moderation then must be very much leaning towards interpretation and that ability to interpret rather than just strict rule checking.
I mean, we definitely have rules. I think rules are really important as a minimum standard so that everybody understands at a minimum level what is expected of them. But we also do take into account context often when we're moderating.
That's moving on then into the risk landscape. When people think about marketplace trust and safety, they are predominantly going to think about fraud or counterfeits. And I imagine, that is probably something that Depop has to deal with on some level. But what are the trust and safety risks that actually consume the most time at Depop?
So for us, a lot of our work goes into preventing issues before they happen. One way that we do that is via user education. And we focus on helping really well-intentioned users to understand those expectations so that issues don't arise in the first place. And when a user does make a genuine mistake, we ensure that they're given an opportunity to understand why, what they did was not in line with our rules, and how they can avoid making that same mistake again. So we spend time looking at education, setting expectations, resolving any misunderstandings that may have happened there. Many issues arise from users wanting to do the right thing, but perhaps lacking clarity on what that is or how they can go about doing that. So Depop has 3 main sources of information accessible via the app and the website that can help users to understand how to browse and interact and transact really safely on Depop. So firstly, we have the help center. We've also got the community guidelines, and we also have safety tips and guidelines. So if you're a user and anything's ever seemed unclear, go and find these things. I'm sure they'll be helpful. And if you're not a user, try and sign up and have a look, because I'm sure there'll be something there for you that you'll find exciting and interesting.
It's great to hear that is something then as a strategy they're pushing towards the proactive rather than the firefighting reactive that we hear from so many trust and safety teams. That sounds like it cuts against a lot of assumptions actually, and it sounds like it's really positive.
Yeah, it definitely requires very firm intention to carve out the time to move from reactive to proactive. And as I'm sure many listeners of this podcast will know, who I assume will probably be in the trust and safety space themselves, that culture of urgency can really snowball within the trust and safety function, and it can feel relentless at times. So as much as you can get on the front foot and move into the proactive space, the better for users, the business, and those working in that space.
I suspect a lot of teams listening will be nodding along to everything that you've said there, Sophie. What's one trust and safety issue that you encountered at Depop that genuinely surprised you, either because of its scale or its complexity or how users responded to it?
Yeah, so we had an interesting example where we reviewed our position on Washington Redskins merchandise. We were operating in a really complex cultural context when this was done. So vintage sportswear is a really meaningful part of Depop's ecosystem. But the name and the branding of that are now widely recognized as offensive. So we therefore made the decision to classify it as prohibited content. After this, many sellers were genuinely confused or frustrated. For them, it was simply a retro item that they had owned for many years with no intent to cause harm. So in several cases, people were not yet aware of the broader cultural shift around the name. And this became a really strong example of what modern trust and safety looks like in practice, because the work is not simply limited to removing clearly harmful content. It's really important that the world of trust and safety involves responding to how cultural norms evolve and supporting a global community to move with those changes. So that means balancing harm prevention with education and context and empathy. So this case really underscored for us that policies are not static rule books and never should be, but rather living frameworks that must adapt alongside those changing societal expectations and norms.
Yeah, those surprises are often when the biggest learnings happen, right? As part of this community of trust issues listeners, it's so important to share those examples because it keeps us grounded. Let's talk about how, evolving users' expectations can change, trust and safety approaches. Depop, I suppose it kind of resonated very strongly with younger users, right? At the outset. But secondhand has become far more mainstream now. So how does a broadening user base change the way that you think about trust and safety?
As secondhand becomes more mainstream, we see a much wider range of experience and expectations coming onto Depop. That feeds into how we think about trust and safety because we can't rely on an assumed level of platform literacy, of resale knowledge, for example. While it's becoming increasingly part of how people shop, there's still so much room for us to grow, which means there's also a need for ongoing education for users as we scale. So then the clarity piece becomes even more important. So not just in our guidelines and our policies, but in how we explain processes and outcomes and what good participation looks like. And that's why we're really keen to ensure that we have very effective feedback loops, because they matter more now than ever, because they help us to sense check whether the protections that we're putting in place and guidance that we're proactively providing and continuing to evolve are actually landing with that broader audience.
And do you have to then take additional considerations into play when moderating peer-to-peer commerce where users have different levels of experience or confidence or there might be a perceived power imbalance?
I think from a trust and safety perspective, what's really important is that we must always be thinking carefully about fairness and accessibility. So whilst we do always take into considerations those different levels of experience and confidence and power, ultimately we want the protections and the processes to work just as well for somebody selling their first item as they do for a highly experienced seller, for example. So really, we're talking about clearer pathways for support, dispute resolution, and review being very, very important for all, regardless of experience or confidence.
It sounds like equity is so important there as much as equality.
Yeah, definitely.
So what's harder then in practice? Setting protective rules or ensuring those rules are understood and accepted by such a diverse community without, over-policing?
So I'm not going to give you an either or answer on this one. I think for us to build a really strong trust framework, you can't just rely on publishing rules alone. Setting rules can often be just the easy part, believe it or not. And then we need to help people understand why those rules exist, how they actually protect the community, and how they're applied in practice. Because we've seen when people actually understand the purpose behind a rule, they're far more likely to engage with it properly. So that balance between protection and participation is where trust is really built. And that balance is like walking a forever changing and wobbly tightrope, as many will no doubt be able to empathize. And that's the ongoing challenge for us.
So it sounds like communication really is as important as enforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
When you think of like marketplaces, particularly in fashion, we often think about the issue of counterfeit items, and they can often sit in a grey area because not every seller is acting with intent. And how do you then distinguish between ignorance and bad faith without, overwhelming your teams?
Yeah, it can be a really tricky area, particularly as businesses grow and scale. So counterfeits are an area where someone's intent does really matter. And as you say, it's really not always obvious from a single listing. So we focus on education, preventing recidivism, and giving users a chance to really learn, while also looking at patterns of behavior and the context to identify sellers who are acting in bad faith and who continue to break the rules. So we have various different ways to detect and enforce against good users who we believe have genuine intent versus bad actors who we believe don't have good intent. And ultimately, we take counterfeit activity really seriously. We use a combination of proactive monitoring and specialist expertise to identify and assess any potential issues in that space. And where there is clear evidence of deliberate misuse, we will take firm action. And that balance allows us to be fair without overwhelming our teams, ultimately.
Okay. And that's really important because, sometimes there can feel like there's a risk of getting, when you get that, getting the distinction wrong could have big impact on users but also on the platform as well in terms of your credibility. So is that a difficult balance to get?
It can be, I think, and I'm sure every platform's on a journey to strike that balance in a way that they feel they've really nailed. I think for us, if we get that distinction wrong, which I mean, we're in a good place right now, but if we get that distinction wrong, the risk for users is, I think, a loss of trust. Particularly if people feel that they're being penalized for really honest mistakes, then there's work to be done there, right? And conversely, bad behavior isn't being addressed as well. So for any platform, it can really undermine confidence in the marketplace and then, unfortunately, discourage participation, which is, of course, something we want to avoid. So that's why proportionate responses to those risks are so important, including things like the review mechanisms, making sure that there's clear communication. They all matter so much. And trust really depends on the user's feeling that the system is very fair and grounded in informed, considered, consistent judgment rather than fast, subjective assumptions.
Moving on to, I suppose, the theme of identity and contextual judgment. Fashion listings inevitably involve bodies. They involve aesthetics. They involve identity. Where do moderation teams struggle the most when distinguishing something like sexualized content from legitimate self-expression?
So first, I think it's really important to acknowledge that everybody has a different perspective on what is sexualized. So it's really important that we have clear internal policies for our agents to follow to help them make an objective decision every time, rather than basing moderation decisions on subjective judgment. We focus on having really well-defined policy definitions, plus guidance for agents, who also use decision trees and visual guides to help them make really consistent decisions and avoid bias in this area.
It's so important then that moderators are equipped, like you said, with the decision trees, with the materials that help them come to the right decision or as close to the right decision as possible. How do you train moderators to make those judgment calls consistently, without flattening individuality or culture?
So we start from the position of saying our goal is to prevent agents from actually having to make any subjective judgment calls. So we think about how we develop our policies to really maximize free expression, protect individual expression and cultural differences, and prohibit content only where it's harmful. And then we work closely with the trust and safety teams, content moderators, our QA teams, and training teams to make sure that those policies are applied consistently in practice. We also have a clear and robust policy framework and tree. So that includes policies on sexually inappropriate content and behavior, nudity, and keeping our users safe. So users who breach any of those guidelines will either be warned, temporarily suspended, or permanently banned from Depop, depending on the severity of the breach.
It really reinforces for me the value, certainly, of human moderators. And we'll talk about humans and AI in a few minutes. But I also want to talk a little bit about sustainability. Depop positions sustainability and circular fashion at the core of its mission. Does that ethos then influence how you develop trust and safety policies?
At Depop, as you say, our mission is to make fashion circular. And to enable that, the experience has to be both functional and really magnetic for users. So it needs to be intuitive for them and reliable, but also full of personality, and a destination that feels really rewarding to use and worth returning to and worth recommending to their friends and family. Our circular business model depends on participation in the long run, and that's really key. So people don't just buy and sell with us, they also connect, they share their own personal style, they exchange clothing, and they express who they are. And that's what makes the platform really special. And it's also why trust and safety is so central to how we operate, because circular fashion depends on trust. And so our trust and safety policies aren't just designed to prevent harm in the moment, but also to support really safe and responsible participation over time, whether someone is a first-time buyer or a really seasoned seller. So protecting that sense of confidence and trust is really essential to sustaining the community and the marketplace.
It's a real great example of how mission can act as a policy compass. It's wonderful, really. Does a sustainability first identity shape community expectations around fairness or transparency, or you mentioned restorative approaches to enforcement? Does it change your users' expectation?
Well, because Depop is built around community and real human connection, many of our users come to the platform expecting more than just efficient transactions. So they're engaging with people whose style and values and stories they truly relate to. And we really pride ourselves on being a people-powered platform and not just a transactional one.
And so I suppose that means then that they want a human approach to enforcement as well. And like, for, again, not a real binary approach to decision making. I'd imagine your users would expect there to be a more holistic approach to enforcement.
Yeah, and I think, we've taken those sorts of signals from our users on board, and it's helped us to develop comms which are really personal and, tailored to the different user bases. So we've definitely been mindful of that in how we've developed our trust and safety approach.
We can't not talk about humans and AI and the road ahead. So how does AI support trust and safety at Depop?
So at Depop, AI is most valuable when it helps our teams to see those patterns that would be difficult for humans to spot alone. So, for example, emerging trends or shifts in behaviors. And it's also helped us to support early detection by surfacing signals rather than making decisions itself. So human judgment remains essential, particularly in a creative, community-driven marketplace like Depop. But automated systems alone can't reflect community values. So the trust and safety decisions often require nuance and human insight. So it's very much a blend. And at Depop, we think about AI very much as a bridge and not a barrier. So helping to translate information, reduce that cognitive load, and give people better inputs to make those fair decisions. And it's used to support human decision-making rather than replacing it.
As I often say to folks who've been terrified in the trust and safety world, that AI is here to replace us all. Humans are always going to need to be in the loop, especially when it comes to judgment-based decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it should be a key principle of good AI governance to always have humans in the loop.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, Sophie, as resale, as social commerce and creator-led marketplaces continue to blur together, what trust and safety challenges do you foresee the industry having that perhaps they're underprepared for?
I'm sure there are many, particularly in the unknown unknowns category, but three that spring to mind. The first one is AI-generated receipts of proof of purchase and authenticity, particularly for a peer-to-peer fashion marketplace. The second being false social signals to manipulate trust. So, for example, fake likes, follows, engagement that mimics real and genuine users, but in fact are not. And many platforms are still, I think, underprepared to detect those social engineering signals effectively that hide behind community credibility. And then the third is around evolution of personal harm versus marketplace issues spilling into harassment and off-platform abuse as platforms grow and social features grow. So platforms, I don't believe, are not yet at least, fully equipped to manage this shift from transaction risk to kind of personal safety risk. So I think we'll see these three areas evolve in the near term.
And there won't be a quick fix to that. That's going to require organizational and really solid investment in trust and safety spaces.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Sophie, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Trust Issues and for sharing your insights into what is a fascinating and exciting online platform.
Thanks so much, Eilish. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to Trust Issues, brought to you by Web Purify, an InTouch CX company. What are your thoughts on today's conversation? And what do you want to hear about next? Get in touch with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to keep the discussion going. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories, insights, and behind-the-scenes voices from the world of trust and safety.